we continue with the Q&A. Charlie, still please. Coming back to your experience and your sharing your moments with us just now. When President Kennedy said he wanted to send people to the moon, did you believe that it could happen, it was possible? What was the sentiment between you and the other pilots?
As I said, I was a young lieutenant at Ramstein, and I thought it was way outside the possibility that we could do it in 8.5 years. Turned out we did it 8 years and 2 months. And so the accelerate, 400,000 people, all the major aircraft companies involved in the program, and you put all this technology and engineering into it. If you put the money on a program like that, you're going to have success. And sure enough, even with the setback of Apollo 1, we felt like by then, when I was at MIT, I felt like we were going to get it done. I'd changed my mind.
Yeah. When you were in space, you used all sorts of tools and equipment, and you had to really be able to rely on them. How important was the Speedmaster for you? You already spoke a bit about the stopwatch function.
Well, of course, we kept time. In space, there's no night on the way to the moon, so how do you keep time? We had a clock in the spacecraft that started at liftoff. It starts counting up at 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, and your flight plan is based on that clock. So I kept my watch on Houston time, but you'd sort of lose sight of, well, is it PM or AM? I just had time, the time in the spacecraft was based on the clock that we had, but in the spacecraft. But the importance of the Speedmaster was its stopwatch, and it was really, really important that I time the burns accurately, because if the computer, as I said, if the computer didn't shut it down automatically, we used the watch to back it up. And for instance, on re-entry, Mission Control told us when re-entry would start, and let's say 2 minutes later, we would have a rollover. Apollo didn't have wings like Space Shuttle, but it had lift like an airplane. The center of gravity was offset from the center of the heat shield. So as you came in with a lift vector up like an airplane. And so when it dug into the atmosphere, it wanted to come back out again, and we called it skip out. And if you allowed that to happen, you were lost, and there was no recovery. So it was so at the point of reentry beginning, I started my stopwatch, and it was, I don't know, let's say 2 minutes. I don't remember exactly the numbers, but it was a certain number. So when I got to that number, I gave it 1 second, 2 seconds. And if after 2 seconds, if the autopilot didn't roll it over and pull us back in, we would take over manually. But as I started counting 1, it rolled over. So we were okay, stayed on the autopilot. But it was very critical to back up every major burn with the Speedmaster stopwatch function.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jean-Claude, you told me yesterday the year you were born, I think by accident. So you witnessed the moon landing perhaps, and some other missions. What are your recollections of the space program, moon landings?
You know, in 1969, I saw, of course, the adventure of Apollo 11, and with all my friends at school, everybody wanted to be an astronaut. I was 12 years old, so imagine we built rockets in cardboards. I used to do computers with Legos, with mechanos, and we were dreaming all the time about these heroes. And I remember also the 1st of August is the National Day in Switzerland, and you do fireworks. So I asked my parents to buy fireworks in advance, and we painted the fireworks to make a rocket. So it was really cool. And of course, other souvenirs, there are so many. One that is, I think, a strong one was with Gene Cernan. It was in Baselworld for I think it was the 40th anniversary of Apollo 17. And a journalist asked Gene, but how do you do on the moon to know if it's 7 in the morning or 7 at night? And Gene answered so beautifully, I look to my Speedmaster and I see 7, I look to the Earth and I see the sun growing up above Houston, and I know that my little daughter is having breakfast. So beautiful, I think. And maybe another experience was the X-33, also in Baselworld. We launched the X-33 in the Mir station, and we had communication from Basel with Mir when they flew above Basel. That was really a nice moment, yes. But so many of the events we do now with all these legends is so great for me.
Yeah, I see. And were you aware before you joined Omega, I assume you did join at 12, were you aware of the role of the Speedmaster before you joined Omega with space and Apollo 13 perhaps?
I think the first souvenir I have of a Speedmaster was when I saw the movie Apollo 13. I think it was in 1995, so it was before I joined Omega, yes. Yeah.
Charlie, when you were an astronaut, did you share your experience about your watch with Omega? Was there a possibility to talk to them about the watch?
Not that I recall. We had an engineer, Jim Reagan, yeah, thank you. Jim Reagan, who was in charge of the watches. And he assigned you a watch, and I remember talking to him about the watch and the operations and just how he come about selecting Omega. And there's a wonderful story about that. But we turned the watch, the one I got, we turned it in every 6 months or so, cleaning and all. But it was not directly related to any Omega people at that point. After the flight, of course, we met people, and I met Omega people, and it started a relationship that's continued on for now up to 50 years, and so I'm just delighted to be here and have the opportunity to get to meet the folks that could design and manufacture and distribute. So Dorothy and I are delighted to be here. So thanks a lot.
And have you ever tried the Speedmaster X-33 that astronauts currently use in space, the digital Speedmaster?
Yeah, the X-33, right? Yeah. I talked to Tom Stafford 10 years or so ago, no, longer than that now. Beginning of 81 was the beginning of the shuttle, and I remember Tom telling me he went to the shuttle astronauts and says, what do you guys need in a watch? And so he got that, well, we'd like this feature and that feature and this feature. And so I think he took them all to you guys, and at headquarters and said, hey, this is what we'd like, and out came the X-33. So I said, I'd like one of those, and so I got one of those, and I still haven't figured out how to use it all. I mean, it's got everything, but as we say, but the kitchen sink in it, and so it's a great watch. I prefer the old style, but I do wear the X-33 occasionally.
Talking about the old style Speedmaster, Jean-Claude, can you tell us a bit about the changes that were, the improvements that were made since the Speedmaster was used during the first tests in '64 till what it eventually became?
So you know that it's in the DNA of Omega to improve the products every day. And the funny thing is that the watch that was tested by Jim Reagan was generation number 3 for me. And because he got the product from Norman Morris, who gave him the watch to be tested, and that was 1963, and on the market was already the generation 4 with the professional name, with the protection of the crown and the pushers, was on the market. And I think Norman Morris said, okay, I have some old watches, I send these to NASA. And so we have already improved the watch before the watch was tested by NASA. That's an example.
Take these old ones.
Charlie, do you have any recollection of using the watch while walking on the moon or being on the moon?
Not in a serious time way, but we did keep track. We knew we were going to be outside for 7 hours or so. And I looked at my watch as I got out, and I forgot exactly what time it was. And I knew at each stage of our excursion onto the moon how much time was to be there and how much and where we were supposed to be at certain times. So I occasionally looked at the watch that way. But the primary time was not my Speedmaster, but Mission Control.
Yeah.
They helped keep us on schedule because you got so busy on the moon, you sort of lost track of time. And you were so excited, let's go over here, let's get this rock. And so you wanted to collect all of these rocks, and your focus was the experiments that you were doing, the collection of samples that you were doing, and you basically left it up to Mission Control to spur you on to the next spot.
Yeah, yeah. Just like Jean-Claude just said, some astronauts, they said, when we looked at our watch while being in space or on the moon, we had a connection with home. We knew what our family was doing or what our friends were doing. If I ask you the opposite, if you look at your watch, at your Speedmaster today, what kind of memories does it bring back? Does it have a strong association with those moments in space or with NASA?
Well, not so much from what's the family doing at home. From where we stood on the moon, the Earth was directly overhead. And you never saw it. You looked up to see the Earth and you're looking at the top of your helmet. So it wasn't an ability. I mean, even holding onto the rover and bending over backwards, it was hard for me to see the Earth because it was right overhead. And I remember looking up occasionally, and we had to point the antenna at the Earth to get TV, and you had a little periscope, and you could look through here, and you could center the Earth. And so as I looked up, I remember seeing a half Earth, and so the moon was half in the sky as in relation to the Earth, and the Earth was going towards the new, and the moon was going towards the full phase. And so I could tell that the time was changing, but when we the 3 days that we had on the moon, we spent we split that up into 3 24-hour periods. So when they woke us up, they would tell us what time it was on the Earth, so what day it was, and you know, you sort of lost track of time because you're always in daylight. From sunrise to sunset on the moon's 2 weeks. So the 3 days we were there, it was always daylight. You could tell time was changing because the shadows, the higher the sun got, the shorter the shadows got on the surface. And so those are the kind of things I remember as far as time. But in Gene's case, that answer he gave was he could look out and see the Earth, and he could watch it more regularly than we could, I guess, and because it was just up there. And to be honest, the only time I really saw it was when I fell over backwards. Hey, there it is, right out there. And my heart was just pounding, of course. So the watch was there as a backup, as I remember, and I kept looking at it, make sure that we were basically on schedule, because we had I was dependent on mission control to hurry us along if we were getting behind.
Exactly. But if you look at your watch today, does it has a special meaning for you?
Oh yeah, it does. That's why, you know, I've been wearing them now since 1960. I think I got my first one in 1968 as we began to get involved in training. And it's a watch that that I used for some critical moments in space flight and critical moments in mission control. And it's reliable, and I enjoy wearing it, and it brings back since 1968, I'm dependent on a Speedmaster. So
Very good.
very nice.
Jean-Claude, do you receive a lot of feedback from collectors and enthusiasts about Speedmaster? And well, except for those Speedy Tuesday guys, do they request sometimes to have a special watch made?
Yes, I have many Omega fans or Speedmaster fans who are writing to us or to me, asking, could you do this model again, could you do this one? And I think if I would collect all these ideas, I could do a new brand called Speedmaster and with many watches. Of course, we are listening to collectors, as we worked also with Speedy Tuesday with you, with the 2 special editions we made. We were talking together, should we do this, should we do that, and at the end you saw the result. So yes, we're listening to the fans.
And was the resurrection of the Caliber 321 also a result of that, of getting feedback from enthusiasts?
Of course, everybody is expecting the 321, but the story is a little bit different. It was just after Reinhard Eschliman, our CEO and president, was nominated. You know that I do the product strategy, and I went to him saying, listen, Apollo 11 is coming in 3 years. Don't you think we should do something with the 321? I said, yeah, great idea. He said, but how shall we do that? Because, you know, it's part of Breguet, legacy. We should ask Marc Hayek. And so Reinhard went to Marc Hayek, asking, could Omega, for this special occasion, have the 321? And he said, yes. Exception. We can do the dream of many collectors and to redo the 321. And after a while, maybe 1 year later, it was in 2017, I went to the purchasing department saying, listen, now we have to order this movement because it's in 2 years, Apollo 11 is coming. And we're talking about quantities, and I said, listen, let's order 10,000 pieces. And the order came to Breguet. They had an immediate answer of Mark Alexander. Are you totally crazy? We are doing 2,000 for Breguet a year, and you want 10,000? I cannot do that. So I was really not so happy. And, but during the week, we talked with a member of the Concernleitung, the KL of Salzburg. His name is Pierre-André Buller. He's the boss of ETA. Talking about my disappointment, and he said, but listen, I'll do the assembly line for you at Omega. Looking with Kena like this, can we do that? And he said, yes, we can. And that's what we are doing. It will not be in the Speedmaster Apollo 11, this you know, for now, but it will be starting, it will be in our collection, in our core collection. We'll have the 321. Now the numbers between 1,000, 2,000 movements or watches a year, starting end of 2019.
Thank you, very nice to share, because I think we receive and discuss it a lot, what will happen to it. Charlie, something unrelated to watches. When you were on the moon in '72, you left something very personal on the moon. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, it was a very special opportunity for me. 2 events. One was I was the only Air Force officer that was to land on the moon in 1972, and the U.S. Air Force had its 25th anniversary of the start of the U.S. Air Force. It's 1947. They split off the Air Force from the Army. It used to be the Army Air Corps, and now it's going to be the United States Air Force. And so that was their beginning. Their birthday really was in 47. So now it's 25 years later. And so I asked NASA, could I take and say happy birthday Air Force? And so that's a good idea. So I got permission from the Air Force. They sent me a special medal, a little flag that I carried to the moon with me. I left one of the medals up on the moon and made a little talk about happy birthday. But the most personal thing I did was at the end is to leave a small photograph of my family on the lunar surface. Our kids at the time the photograph was taken, Charles had just, our eldest was 7. There's a picture of it right there. It was, and our other son was just about 5. And so we were training in Florida, but the family was living in Houston. So I was gone all the time. And so to get the boys really, to get them excited about what their dad was doing was to say, would you like to go to the moon with me? Of course, they said, that's a great idea. So, of course, you can't do it really, but we can take a picture of the family, and that way you can be on the moon with Dad. So we had a NASA photographer take this picture in our backyard, and Deke Slayton, who was the director of flight crew operations, gave me permission to take it. And so on the back of the picture we had written, this is the family of astronaut Charlie Duke, who landed on the moon in April 1972, and we all signed it. And so I dropped the picture onto the surface and took a picture of the picture, which has probably been one of the most reproduced photographs of all of Apollo. It's the only time that a family photo was taken to the moon and deposited on the moon. And the only other thing represented, Gene Cernan on Apollo 17 drew his daughter Tracy's initials onto the surface and took a picture of that. So we've had a lot of comments from that picture. When I dropped it, the temperature on the surface of the moon was probably about 115 centigrade and getting hotter because it wasn't quite high noon at the time. And so if you look closely on the picture, you can see it begin to curl up on the periphery. So now, 47 years later, for us, it's still there, but it's probably a black ball of ashes because of 47 years of 200 degrees to minus 270. It's a lot of change in exposure. In fact, they think that the flags that we left up there have all faded away due to the cosmic radiation. So it would be just a white sheet today. But it was, fortunately, I took the picture of the picture, and there's a guy in Bern, Switzerland, named Rob Lewis, who's done a documentary on, he calls it Lunar Tribute, and the what do you call it, Don? The debut of this Lunar Tribute film is going to be in late June this year. So we'll be back for that. And,
Stamos, yeah.
And part of Stormus. That's not part of Stormus, but we'll be there for Stormus in Zurich, and then we're going to go down to Bern for that special screening. And then we'll see you all for the dedication of the new museum, I think it was.
Yes, beginning of
July, first part of July. So the little picture has created a lot of comments. Everybody says, tell me what your kids thought. And well, they really don't remember very much. My dad was born in 1907, so just 4 years after the Wright brothers. And in his life, he saw 4 years after the Wright brothers till his son landed on the moon, and all of that in between. And he couldn't believe it till the day he died that his son had landed on the moon. Tom was 5 at the time. He didn't think it was any big deal, The whole neighborhood was going to the moon. We had next door neighbor was Bill Anders. A block behind us was Neil Armstrong. Ron Evans was our back door neighbor. Owen Garriott, Jerry Carr, and Fred Hayes. Stu Russa lived in our neighborhood. Frank Borman lived in our neighborhood. Tom Stafford lived in our neighborhood. So everybody's going to the moon. So it was no big deal to them, and all their buddies were, either dads worked or moms worked at NASA as engineers or technicians or something. So our whole little 1,200 home subdivision, either you worked at NASA or you were an astronaut or something. So it was no really big deal that your dad was going to the moon. But now they're grown men, of course, and they think it's a big deal. My grandchildren think it's a really big deal. They call me Grand Duke. So Grand Duke went to the moon.
Very nice, very amazing story. I think it's time for some questions from you guys. There's a microphone. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question?
What's the story with Ken Mattingly's wedding ring? Was it really true that you saw it floating in space and shining?
Yeah, that was a great story. Mattingly was our command module pilot, and in Apollo we had no showers or anything like that, so to basically get clean up, you would get down in the lower, what we call the lower equipment bay, take everything off, and then wet down a towel and just rub down with this towel. So that kept us sort of refreshed. Well, when you did that, Mattingly, we all had a storage area down in the lower equipment bay, and so he stored his constant wear garments and rings, watches, all things like that. And so when he got, this was the second day, and as he got dressed again, everything was there except his wedding ring, and it had floated out of this place. It was somewhere in the spacecraft, but we couldn't find it. So this was 2 days later, we arrived at the moon. The next day, John and I landed. 3 days later, we arrived back at the command module and started our journey home, and he's still looking for this wedding ring. And so on the way home, we had what we call EVA, but a spacewalk. And so we were moving through space at this point, probably 5,000 to 6,000 kilometers per hour. And so we opened the hatch. Mattingly gets out to go to do some work at the bottom of the service module. I float out to tend his, make sure he's okay, and was sort of his lifeguard. And about an hour later, I float back inside, and Mattingly comes in and is starting to work now on a biological experiment that was attached to a 3-meter pole on the hatch. So he's about 3 meters out. I'm looking through the hatch, watching all this, and a beautiful sight, you know, the blackness of space, and here's this astronaut just out there silhouetted against the blackness of space. And I'm looking at that, and all of a sudden I get this glint of gold, and I look over, and his ring is floating out the door. And it was the spacecraft, when you depressurize, all the air doesn't rush out. It's molecular movement, just slowly moving this this ring out the hatch. And I'm wedged in down below, and I break loose and reach for it, and I miss it, and it floats out the hatch, lost in space. But it I don't know, maybe a minute or two it took. It was moving very slow, but it went out and hit him on the back of the head. And so, you know, round ring, round helmet, it's going to bounce off. Well, when it hit, it took a 180-degree bounce and started back towards the hatch. And about a minute or two later, it floated right back in front of me, and I grabbed his ring. So it was told that story 1,000,000 times, probably. Yeah.
Question for you.
I have two questions. One for Mr. Took and for Omega. What are your thoughts about the new Orion project going back to the moon? And to Omega, how involved is Omega in this new endeavor to go back to the moon? Because Speedmaster is now celebrating we have been to the moon, and going back is coming something.
Well, let me say I'm all for going back to the moon. I've been 10 years lobbying for a return to the moon. I think it's a great place to go establish a science base. A lot of science you can do from a permanent station on the moon. You're near enough so you have instant communications. You get resupply from Earth, and you can develop the systems that last a long time that you have confidence in. And those systems you can then incorporate into a spacecraft to go to Mars. And I think it's a great place to establish confidence in these systems nearby so that you can have help and repair and maybe manufacturing systems that you can then take to Mars, not launch from the moon to Mars, but to build these and take these systems from Earth, and then when you launch to Mars, you're on your own, and no resupply, no help. When you get to Mars, basically you're autonomous, and you need the confidence in those systems that they're going to survive. And so you will have known how to repair them, how to modify them, whatever you have to do to keep these things working at Mars, with basically no response from Houston. You know, from Mars, I don't, depends on where Mars is its orbit, but hello Houston, well, 6 minutes later or whatever it is, they hear you. So then the response, so I mean, 20 minutes or whatever it is, you can, a lot can happen in space. So you better be able to repair and work basically on your own and without help from Houston. So I think the moon is a great place for the science and to develop these systems that eventually will take us to Mars.
Will you go back to the moon?
I would go to the moon, not to Mars. At my age, 2.5 year trip to Mars or whatever it is beyond my capacity. But like I said somewhere the other day, it was, I guess to George Clooney, he said, would you ask me the same question? I said, I'd go back, I'd volunteer, but NASA says, don't call me, I'll call you. I'm not waiting for that phone to ring.
To answer your question, I was last Friday in Paris, and I met Jean-François Clairvoy, who went twice on the ISS. With him, we developed the Skywalker X-33, and I asked him the question, shall we do something for the moon? And he said, the watch you have today for the astronauts is perfect for the moon. But in the same time, I asked a question about Mars. Shall we do something for Mars? And there will be a flight to Mars in July or August, depending the window of 2020, with a project called ExoMars, where we'll go with a robot and dig into 2 meters to analyze the Mars. And he asked me, maybe there was an engineer with Jean-François Clairvoy who made a notebook of what would be useful on Mars. It was quite complicated to understand, but really nice. So now, question is, do I have time to do it for July next year? And I will have to analyze that with our engineers in beginning of next week. But another problem would be now to go to NASA and ask them, what do you need to go to the moon or to Mars? And I think that the NASA today should, if I ask that, should ask that to other brands, because it's like this. So, shall we do it, shall we not? It's not really easy. So we are looking also for that with people from NASA.
Any other questions?
Flight director Gene Kranz, what's he like? What was he like to work with? And were his waistcoats kind of as crazy as everybody, makes out?
Yeah, his wife made those, sewed those together, and it was her design and her concept of what he needed, and so they were unique for each flight. And Gene I worked with him on the same, he was the flight director for Apollo 10 and Apollo 12. We became really good friends. He was very professional, a very motivating flight director. I got to meet all of them, Jerry Griffin, Milt Wendler, Cliff Charlesworth, and Glenn Lunny. They were all worked together, different flight directors, but they were all a cadre of very, very professional folks, and had been trained by Chris Graff into a very finely tuned team, if you will. And it was a real pleasure working for Kranz. He was not an autocrat, but he was a very fine conductor of the team. And he kept everybody focused, and he was very demanding, as he should have been. In the training, we would train with the crew in crew in the simulator at Florida. We were in mission control. We were tied together, and we did that probably 2 or 3 times a week. And we made a lot of mistakes in this time, but we would review all the mistakes, and I recall Kranz was did not curse everybody out. He was very demanding. Let's not do this again. And so we were very, very well trained when we got there. And I would say like he was like an orchestra conductor conducting his very fine-tuned symphony, which was the flight controllers. It was a pleasure working with him. He's still a friend.
We have another question from, yeah.
Mr. Duke, thank you very much for all the exciting and really entertaining stories you're sharing with us this morning. You spoke about the excitement and the 400,000 people carrying you to the moon. And from your perspective, what are the key ingredients to create this excitement and to make the impossible possible?
To me, as a fighter pilot and as a test pilot, the best flight you could have was going to the moon. It was the ultimate experience for a pilot. Is that what you're referring to? Is how we approached it, and the way I just knew that if I got one of these flights, I would be very, very fortunate, and it would be the ultimate experience for me as a test pilot, and it turned out that way. You know, from the moment we left until we splashed down, it was a great adventure. Even though the moon, you felt right at home on the moon. It wasn't like you were an alien in a foreign land. You just felt like you belonged. And the beauty of it, the characteristics, the brightness, the feel, all of that just melded into making it an experience that was unforgettable. And that's why I can vividly recall just about every footstep. So if you want to go get one flight, go to the moon.
I think we have time for one more.
Thank you. One question. Is there one little thing, an invention, that really made it possible to go to the moon and go out? Was it a transmitting, or I know Omega speed march was one thing, or is it just a combination of 1,000 little things that make it happen, or was it a shield or protection or transmitting? Is there one thing would you say that was a breaking point that we could have made it?
the critical thing on the ground and in flight was the computer. Yeah, you needed the computer for the guidance and the control of the engine, and without that, you were not allowed to. You couldn't land. We tried from start to finish manually flying, and you can actually do that. And we had a program in Saturn V that actually at liftoff, Stu Russo and I flew it into orbit manually. They never implemented the first stage, but the second and third stage program was in the instrument unit in the Saturn. Fortunately, we never had to use it. The computer was really critical, and the miniaturization of the pieces in the computer was really important to fit into this space that was allotted for it on the lunar module and in the command module. And when you think about the computer was actually, hardware was built by Raytheon, but the software was engineers at MIT. And they had 80K memory to work with. And so within that 80K memory, they put, if I recall, 5 programs. And without the computer, the mission rule was you're not going to land. So I think looking back, probably the computer was the linchpin, if you will. Other equipment that we had, of course, the absolutely necessary were the parachutes. If they didn't open, you were dead. 11-day success, and you hit the water and you sink. But those were basic things. But I look back now, and I think probably the computer was the key that gave us success on Apollo, especially in the lunar module. And it worked. It's amazing. I think probably the hardest thing we had on the last missions, the J missions, which were the 3 days, was when you got down to a certain point, turn off the computer, and you had to flip that switch to off. Are you sure you want to do this, Houston? Because if you flip it back on again and it doesn't come back up, we had an abort guidance system that would probably work, but still it took a lot of courage, I think, to just flip that switch to off. Apollo 15, it worked when they turned it back on, so we had confidence, and it was powering down on the lunar surface was a thoughtful process, I guess you would say. Do we really want to do this? But we knew if we wanted to stay for the 3 days, we had to do it, power down. Well, thank you very much. We've enjoyed it very much. Dorothy and I are always delighted to be here and to get to see you, not only those of you worked on the Speedmaster, but collect it, our collectors. And so thanks for coming. RJ, thank you for organizing these events. I'm glad to be part of Speedy Tuesday, and hopefully you get to do it again sometime around the world.
Thank you very much.
Bless you. Thank you.
Part of Speedy Tuesday is, it sounds a bit awkward perhaps, but we like to take a wrist shot. And that's a photograph of our Speedmasters on the wrist. So I suggest we three, we take a shot first of our watches together. Perfect.